checking everything's working, and I think we are, and I think we're actually live, hopefully fingers crossed, because I'm doing this by myself this week, and other weeks I've had somebody to help me. So good afternoon. And I think we are, and I think we're actually live, hopefully fingers crossed, because I'm doing this by myself this week, and other weeks I've had somebody to help me. So good afternoon. There, that's good. Good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're watching in the world, and welcome to another show of Race, Racism and African Heritage, led by GPAN, which is Global Pan-African Network. And I've put the link for the Facebook page into the chat, so if people wanted to follow GPAN and see some of the other work that they're doing, the great videos that they produce around mental health, and what we need to be doing as a people, particularly around Pan-African education, you can go and follow them on Facebook. So my name is Marcia Garrett, and today I'm going to be doing a talk which has been based on the work that I've been doing for the past 10 or 5 years with young people of African Caribbean origin living in the UK, and a lot of it is around education. I am an informal educator. I've been a youth and community worker for 20 years. And one of the things that I think is crucial is education in the reproduction of racism, white supremacist system. And therefore we can use education to challenge and change that. And today's presentation has actually come at a really apt time, given some of the new guidance produced by the UK government for schools in the UK, and I'm going to touch on that in a little bit because it's blown my mind. So I'm going to screen share, so I will be removing my picture so that people can see the presentation clearly. I'm going to remove that banner, so hopefully you can see this screen here, and I'm going to be looking at how important it is to use a Pan-African approach to education when working with young people of African Caribbean origin, in developing their sense of well-being, self-belief and potential. And I'm going to be using examples given to me by young people of their current experiences in mainstream or formal education, so within actual school. I do run a Pan-African Saturday school. It's moved a bit to Zoom since COVID, but we still meet up and we still share information. And I'm going to explain the reason why I do that. So screen sharing is on. I'm going to make that screen larger. And we are going to get into the presentation. So the two pictures that I've got there on the title screen are Kwame Nkrumah and Steve Biko. And the reason why I've put both of those two gentlemen on is because they are absolutely crucial in promoting an idea of Pan-African education to develop the potential and well-being of young people of African origin. And both of these men, along with others, recognize how our current education system works to create what we call the process of inferiorization. So that's meaning that young people, when they're going through the education system, are actually taught to see themselves as inferior. This is young people of African Caribbean origin. And the wider impact of that is that therefore those young people will not recognize their potential, they will not realize their potential, and it becomes like a self-fulfilling prophecy. So they will see themselves as inferior and will act accordingly. Pan-African education can and does make the difference. And this has been proven in terms of the well-being and creating a positive mental state for young people of African Caribbean origin. So that is what I'm going to be leading on today. Next slide. Whenever I do work with young people, even when it's coming from a Pan-African approach, what I've recognized is there's a system in the UK, and I would argue that this system happens in North America as well as wider Western Europe, where we are not taught where race comes from. So even though every young person who is not white experiences racism at some point in their lives, they may not understand why. And that was the question that I asked myself when I was 7 years old, and a man in his 40s racially attacked me and my brother. And he was actually the catalyst to me wanting to learn and understand more about what is this thing called race, what is this thing called racism? Because I knew it was serious, because an adult attacked me as a child where I was growing up. So I'd spent a lot of time teaching myself, and self-led education is really important. If you don't have access to a Pan-African Saturday school, and that requires funding and planning and time, so they are not available everywhere in the UK, one thing that you can do is take responsibility for your education and buy books that are written by African scholars and African academics to increase your knowledge on pre-colonial Africa. But one of the things that I do is I share with young people how race began, and I let them know that race is a design, it's a concept, nothing more than an idea that has become very powerful and embedded within society, producing negative outcomes for non-white people, specifically for people of African origin. And I use this map, and I'm appreciating it might be quite small on your screen, but I hope you can see it well enough to see the colours. So all the areas in green are places that have been colonized by Western Europe. So this selection here, and by Western Europe, I mean Britain, Italy, Spain, Holland, Belgium, Germany, so on and so forth. I'm sure there's some countries I've left out, but that's Western Europe. Travel across the world, colonizing. And what I explain to young people is when you colonize, you don't just take the land, you destroy every aspect of culture that was held within that country. You essentially break down the people and replace it with your own version. And one of the ways that this was worked very well is by installing and embedding a concept of race. If you look over here, this is a socio-economic racial hierarchy. So when race was designed in the 17th century by a minority of very wealthy and powerful Europeans, white was placed at the top as naturally superior. And then as you can see, proceeding down to what was called savages, which is for people of African origin, was promoted as naturally inferior. This is what is at the root of the concept of race, this ideology of natural white superiority and natural black inferiority. And I argue that this world, we still live to this kind of racial socioeconomic hierarchy where whiteness has privilege and more opportunity. One of the ways that we can look to change this is through education. But it's very important that young people understand that race is nothing more than a design. It's not natural. Therefore, Black people, people of African origin are not naturally inferior. And that's why I give that explanation to young people in my Pan-African school. I don't say this to make them feel bad or to make them feel that they can't produce any changes in their life, but it's important that they have this knowledge because it will help them to make sense of their racialized experiences as they navigate through the world. And importantly, it will help them to stop internalizing this ideology of natural white superiority and natural black inferiority. This next diagram I produced myself. I'm a visual learner, so I like to see pictures, which is why I generally do presentations when I do a talk as well. And I created this diagram to explain how racism, structural racism, white supremacy works. And education, as you can see, is one of the crucial tiers in the reproduction of racism and white supremacy. So what we have at the bottom is the concept of race, and we are taught race from a white supremacist perspective. And the reason why that is an absolute fact is because race was created by white supremacy for white supremacy, so it can't be anything other than that. And as I said already, at the root of the concept of race is the ideology of natural white superiority and natural black non-white inferiority. So this is at the basis. And that feeds in to our education. So that's our formal education system, our mainstream schools, that the majority of young people will access in the UK, in North America, in Western Europe. They will access formal education in mainstream schools. And then I also have the media there, because the media is a source of informal education. We are actually taught things through the media, whether we're aware of it or not. And within education and within media, non-white contributions to the world, great inventions to the world, are omitted, and white is presented as naturally superior. then all of the people that go through our education system, the formal education system, and to some degree have had education through our informal education system, which is media, then go to work in one of our key social institutions or all areas of people activity. And I've taken that from Dr. Frances Cress-Welsing from her book, The ISIS Papers. And what I mean by key social institutions, these are institutions that all of us will engage with at some point. And because they have been, because the people that go to work in these institutions have all received a whitewashed education, they are going to reproduce it in their workplace, whether they're aware of it or not. I don't like the term subconscious bias, and I don't tend to use the term subconscious bias. Some other points that I've put here is that structural racism or white supremacy is both reproduced and protected via our key social institutions. And one of the ways that it's protected is what I call the 3Ds of white supremacy, which is to deny, defend, or distract. And I'll just give a quick example using the criminal justice system. That's what this one is here. CJS stands for criminal justice system. So that's police and courts, etc. So what we do know is in the UK, a black person is more likely to get a custodial sentence. That means they're more likely to go to prison than a white person for the same crime. Then if we look at media, the media, and this was in a report that was done in 2011 by Cardiff University, the media overall, when it comes to stories about black men and boys, they're overall negative and link black men and boys to crime. And then when you look at politics, so I'm sort of following the circle round, when you look at politics, certain policies and legislation have been put in place which endorse what the media says regarding linking black men and boys to crime, and endorse what the criminal justice system does in terms of giving longer custodial sentences to black people for the same crime as white people. And an example of that would be the gangs matrix, which was put in place in London following the shooting of Mark Duggan, that overwhelmingly targets and disproportionately targets young black men. That then impacts on them going into employment because their details are shared with potential employers, and it also impacts on them in education because that information about them being on the gangs matrix is shared with schools, which will then impact on how they're treated. So this is just a sort of simplistic diagram of how structural racism works, but how important formal education with regards to schools and informal education is in reproducing racism and the white supremacist system. So now we're going to look a little bit more at what I mean by a Eurocentric education system. So in the UK, in the US, in Western Europe, our education system works to focus on European culture and history predominantly. And I spoke a little bit about that in the previous slide when I was talking about how non-white contributions to the world are omitted. And in fact, I would go a step further to say that when it comes to the African continent, everything to do with the African continent is presented as inferior, particularly through our media, but also through our education system. So for example, when I work with young people and I ask them about what they're taught regarding African history, one of the things that comes up again and again and again will be that teachers say slaves were taken from Africa. So what that does is it automatically inferiorizes people of African origin and people that live on the African continent by calling them slaves. And that language is incorrect because it's not slaves were taken from Africa. African people who have rights and feelings and are human beings were kidnapped and taken from the continent, forced into slavery to develop and support European capitalism. So if they'd said it in those terms, it wouldn't be so Eurocentric. But to say that slaves were taken from Africa is a Eurocentric term because it gives the idea that Africans were naturally slaves, naturally inferior. And I've taken a quote here from the Vice Principal at King's College in London. Eurocentric education is complicit in racism because it diminishes other valid ways of knowing and learning. There should be room for pluralism of ideas so that students find a sense of belonging and expand their worldview. And I argue that's not actually happening currently in our education system. keep going to click on the picture, and I need to click on the slide. One of the things that I always ask young people is, what are you taught then? What are you taught about Black history, Black people? What are you taught? And it's always this. And what's so disappointing is I'm coming up for 40 years old. I was only taught about Martin Luther King, the civil rights movement in America, and Rosa Parks. And when I ask young people now, and I'm the generation above, when I ask young people now what they're being taught, it's the same thing. Our education system has not evolved to include other figures. I also think that it's really problematic when in the UK and in Western Europe, there's a big focus on the American civil rights movement, because what that does is it presents racism and white supremacy as being only something that exists in America. And we saw that sort of recently as well with the recent sort of Black Lives Matter protest. There was a big emphasis on the fact that the killing of George Floyd happened in America, therefore it's an American problem. And that's one way to diminish the reality of racism in Britain and Western Europe, who are actually pioneers of the white supremacist system through racialized slavery and colonialism. One of the things as well that I've noticed, and young people tell me this as well, is that the only thing that they're really taught about Martin Luther King is that he took a non-violent approach to protesting, and the I Have a Dream speech. Both of those things actually work out for the white supremacist system, because what they would like us to do is follow Martin Luther King's example of non-violence. Now, some people would argue that the amount of violence that is shown towards people of African origin warrants violence in return. But yet in education, it's presented that we must follow the example set by Martin Luther King. What's missing, crucially, is that Martin Luther King did a talk many years after the I Have a Dream speech, and it was called Dreams for a Nightmare, and he did it for NBC in America. And what he was talking about, which isn't shared widely in our education system, what he was talking about was the reality of socioeconomic racism, and how what's needed in order to have true equality is not just integration, it's about creating the right environment for Black people to have equal access to the same pay, for example, as white people. And what he said in that interview, Dreams for a Nightmare, is that when that was presented to the white moderate who had marched with him and who had stood up against blatant forms of racism, he said that the response was, we didn't intend for it to go that far, meaning that the privilege was going to be removed. So those are some of the problems that we have in our education system with regards to impacting on the well-being and the knowledge of young Black people, is that they are led to believe that there were only two people really that have had any sort of significant impact. And once these people, Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King, had made their stand, ultimately racism sort of ended and changed, which we know is not the case at all. Racism evolved. This is taken from a text called Education and Institutional Racism, written by David Gilborn in 2002. And I think it's a good text. It does focus on the UK. But one of the points that I'm just going to focus on is that he talks about how in schools in particular, the understanding of what institutional racism is very limited, and that people still believe that racism is only blatant. And that's really problematic, because the reality is some of the biggest impact that happens with regards to negative outcomes for Black people is through structural racism, through white supremacy, which is not always blatant, which is actually more time insidious. And he noted that in his studies. He then talked about white backlash, so that when racism is identified, structural racism, institutional racism is identified in schools, that the response is to ignore it and to not hear the voices of Black pupils. And young people tell me this consistently, that they are not listened to, that their experiences of racism are always diminished by teachers, and very rarely is there a positive outcome when they identify racism in schools, particularly if they're challenging a teacher. Oftentimes they'll be put into isolation. So what I argue And one of the work that I think that we should be taking forward from a Pan-African point of view is that our focus should be on working with our young people, not just teacher training, because there's a big emphasis on we need to train teachers to be anti-racist. We need to work with schools to be anti-racist. But I would think that we actually need to work with our young people to develop their understanding, not only of racism, but of pre-colonial African history, so that they can effectively challenge schools. It shouldn't always be on teachers. And I'm going to explain why that's going to be a huge problem given recent events from the government. So this came out on the 24th of September. It's been released by the UK government, and it's under the title Plan Your Relationships, Sex and Health Curriculum. Now, there are a few things said in this document, but I've pulled up this, and I think it's really, really important, given that we're about to have Black History Month in the UK, which takes place in October. So this is what the government have said in this document. Schools should not, under any circumstances, work with external agencies that take or promote extreme positions or use materials produced by such agencies. Examples of extreme positions include, but are not limited to, and I've highlighted the two that I think is really, really important when it comes to dealing with institutional racism in schools. Schools are not allowed to promote divisive or victim narratives that are harmful to British society. I would like to know what on earth that means. What is a victim narrative? Is a victim narrative, for example, somebody who survived the Holocaust coming in and speaking of their experiences? Would that be a victim narrative? Would that be seen as divisive? Or would it be someone like myself going into schools and speaking about the reality of racism in the UK? Is that going to be seen as a victim narrative or divisive? It's really, really dangerous, this wording, in my opinion, and it's not clear. The next point, selecting and presenting information to make unsubstantiated accusations against state institutions. Again, what does that mean? Does that mean if we talk about the disproportionate numbers of Black people being incarcerated in the UK, does that mean that we are giving accusations against a state institution? And would people say it's unsubstantiated because the figures aren't necessarily correct or up to date? This is really problematic. And like I said, it's only just come out on the 24th of September. That's why I argue that the way forward should really be to work with our young people, not to just focus on teacher training and trying to change the school ethos, because that's not going to happen quick enough. It's not going to happen fast enough for our young people who are going through the school system. I am going to play a clip here. Now, what I noticed is, I checked this earlier, the playback is slow, but that doesn't matter because the audio is what counts. And I talk about, and this for me is, I called it whitewashed in teaching has impact. This lady is a teacher and she's speaking about her experiences as a white teacher teaching Black pupils.
In a classroom of students, I'll tend to look at the white students more than I'll look at the Black students. And when I realized I was doing that, I was shocked. And I tried immediately to begin to train myself to stop doing that. And it was astonishingly difficult. There was something about a natural tendency to look at white faces in a way that I did not have the same natural tendency to look at Black faces. And I think that's a kind of an ingrained, inborn racism, is all I can think of it as.
So I give her credit for the fact that she recognized that, but then she also said it was exceptionally difficult for her to change that behavior. Now, this is the thing. The impact of that is for those Black pupils in her classroom, but the fact that she's not giving them eye contact, she's not acknowledging them being there, it will make them feel that education is not for them. So eventually they will begin to withdraw from lessons. And what we know is in this current system, you need education to get a decent job and to have a certain lifestyle, to have a certain freedom, to be able to pursue other things. So they will begin to disengage, and that is the impact of her not being able to look at them. Now, one thing she said that I would disagree with, and that's her understanding, so I'm not putting her down entirely. What I would say is that she said a natural inborn racism. It's not natural. We know that race and racism is taught, therefore it's not natural at all. But I wanted to highlight the impact that's going to have on those students. They will withdraw from education. Those Black pupils are made to feel that this is not for you. This space is not for you. And that's very dangerous when we're wanting young people to go through the education system and fulfill their potential. Like I said, let's put the focus back on those pupils so that if they are sat in a class where the teacher's not giving them eye contact on account of them being Black pupils, they don't internalize that and think we are not worthy, we are not meant to be here, because they've had additional education from a Pan-African perspective. Taking us on to the next slide, and this was said, and I had to copy it because I was actually overwhelmed. I couldn't believe it. This lady here is a head teacher of a school, and she tweeted this, so it's something she put out into the public realm and obviously believes. She said, "Yes, I am being serious. If child says teacher is being racist, back the teacher. Whatever the child says, back the teacher. If you don't, you are letting the child down and allowing them to play you for a fool." Now, my thought process here is, how could you work with somebody like that to make their school an inclusive place for Black pupils? It's going to take a lot of time and a lot of effort. So again, the emphasis should be on young Black people and on working with those young people so that they have the confidence and do not internalize a Eurocentric way of thinking, do not internalize whitewash education that teaches them that they are inferior. This is an excellent, excellent book. Tell it like it is, How Our Schools Fail Black Children. Again, it was written looking at schooling in the UK. But I would argue that some of the theories in this book would apply to North America and would apply to wider Western Europe. So it talks about a pattern of African Caribbean pupils being disproportionately excluded compared to white peers. And I do have a little bit about the school to prison pipeline. If you are excluded from school at a certain age, you are more likely to end up in prison. So that explains some of the disproportionate numbers of young Black men that we have in prison in the UK. Again, obviously, like I said, it has significant impact on a person's life chances. And one thing that's happened is that schools have recognized if they have a well-written race equality action plan, then they can present that and say, well, we are against racism. We are an anti-racist institution because we have this plan. And I think that actually those race equality action plans could be one of the 3Ds of structural racism, which is distract. By putting forward the race equality action plan, schools can sit back and not actually deal with the reality of racism in their schools. So going back to the beginning slide where I talked about the process of inferiorization, inferiority by design, Black inferiorization and the evolution of normalized racism. The goal of inferiorization, and again, this is Dr. Frances Cress-Welsing, is to induce perceived powerlessness and an inferiority complex. That's very real for the young people that I speak to and work with. That is very true. And I've got some of their quotes coming up on the next slide so you can see how that works in practice. An inferiority complex, powerlessness, all of the things that make you feel less than. If you feel less than, you will not be able to enjoy learning, you will not engage with learning, and you will not be able to achieve your potential. Welsing argued that soon white supremacists wouldn't have to worry about making Blacks seem inferior, they just need to keep providing them with inferior education. And in a generation or two, they would be inferior. That's the process of inferiorization that comes from a Eurocentric education. And that's why it's so important that our young people, our young Black people, are supplemented by a Pan-African education. In the 21st century, Black people's main problem is no longer some vaguely understood colour line, but rather, according to Steve Biko, who I had on the first slide, an attitude of inferiority, which can also be defined as internalized racism. Internalized racism is characterized by the stigmatized race's acceptance of negative messages about their abilities and intrinsic worth. As a result, self-devaluation occurs. And once that happens, young people will automatically block themselves from going forward. That's the real danger. And we see this in practice. Internalized racism has made us think of ourselves or each other as stupid, lazy, unimportant, or inferior. So there's a couple of things that I just want to say from that. One is it stops the individual themselves from achieving their full potential. That's first and foremost. But it also means that we are less likely as a people to buy from and support Black businesses because we see each other as naturally inferior and incapable. That's one of the knock-on effects. And these are some quotes from my amazing, amazing young people. And I've got this one at the very top. They never tell us anything good. That's what a young man said to me when he was talking about his experiences in school. And what he meant is they never tell us anything good about Black people. They never tell us anything good about Africa. They never tell us anything good about us. And these young people have said that they feel uncomfortable when there's lessons on Black history, that they feel that everyone watches them, that empire, colonialism is presented as a good thing, as a positive thing, and none of the negatives and the impact that had on the colonized countries is taught in our education system. That pupils are not allowed to call out racism because they are told by teachers to not play the race card. I absolutely hate that term, playing the race card. It shouldn't exist. And again, that goes back to what that head teacher said in the previous slide. This one, you know, that kids are playing the race card. If they say that the racism's happening from a teacher, they must be lying. That's problematic. That's really dangerous for our young people. That young people, they're quick to be punished in comparison to their white peers. If they tell teachers about racism, that teachers don't actually do anything. I argue as well that a lot of teachers don't know what to do. They don't know what to do about it. Therefore, instead of just focusing on teacher training, we really need to focus on developing the education and the self-belief of our young Black people. So those are just some of the quotes from our amazing young people. And that's what I say to them in lessons. Black history doesn't start with slavery. Even though schools consistently try to present it as such. One of my favorite books, Miseducation of the Negro. Whitewashed education reproduces structural racism. I'm going to focus on this second quote here. The same educational process, it applies today. He wrote this in 1933. It applies today in 2020. The same educational process which inspires and stimulates the oppressor with the thought that he is everything and has accomplished everything worthwhile, depresses and crushes the spark in the Negro by making him feel that his race does not amount to much and never will measure up to the standards of other peoples. And from the quotes that I've just shown you, from the young people that I work with that are going through our education system right now, this quote written by Carter G. Woodson is just as relevant today. We still have that same educational process which teaches that everything great in this world came from whiteness and that ultimately anything to do with Blackness is a problem, is inferior. And we also see that coming through in our media as well, which I say is informal education. Whitewashing history removes the contributions made by Black people reproducing racism. And I'm going to give an example of this. So in the UK in particular, World War I and World War II is given a great deal of time in our curriculum. The textbooks that we are given and that I received as a child and that my young people receive right now only ever show white soldiers. So what we are led to believe is that the people that saved the world from this fascist dictator, which was Hitler, was whiteness. So we have a white savior there. And it was only when I got to university at the age of 18 that I found some textbooks which showed me that there was Black and brown soldiers fighting and dying in World War II. They were not allowed to take part in victory parades. They were not allowed to be given medals for their bravery and for their sacrifice because of racism. And that's why it's not covered in our education, the fact that Black and brown soldiers did fight, because the army was still segregated, because Black soldiers were still treated as inferior, despite the fact that they'd given their lives. And I would argue teachers weren't ready to have that conversation, or they didn't have the knowledge to be able to have that conversation effectively. This man here is Charles Drew. He invented blood banks. His invention has saved millions and millions of lives around the world. Yet we are not taught about it. And he invented it during World War II. And yet we were not taught about him. And that's another part of whitewashing history. Now, this clip here is from the documentary Dark Girls. And the reason why I'm playing it is because I want to show the impact of both formal and informal education, which teaches that white is naturally superior, Black is naturally inferior, on the psyche, on the minds of our young Black people.
That we were less than, my mother and her friend, we were driving somewhere, and then she's bragging on me. She said, my daughter is beautiful. She's got great eyelashes. She's got the cheekbones. She's got great lips. And then she's going on and she adds, could you imagine if she had any lightness in her skin at all? She'd be gorgeous. And just that last little part, just all that pride that I had about her, having her brag on me, just dissipated. And I think that moment is when I really became aware.
Show me the smart child. And why is she the smart child?
Because she is white.
Okay. Show me the dumb child. And why is she the dumb child?
Because she's fat.
Well, show me the ugly child. And why is she the ugly child?
Because she's black.
Show me the good-looking child. And why is she the good-looking child?
Because she's light-skinned.
I think I remember.
See, that is the impact of living in a system which consistently shows whiteness as the savior, as best, as superior, and blackness as the direct opposite. That little girl is about, I would say, maybe 5 years old, and she has already learned and she already believes that she's inferior. The danger from this is as she gets older, she will enact behaviors and actions which show that she doesn't believe in herself. And that is the real danger. And this is what we see when it comes to a self-fulfilling prophecy, where when young people are taught, young Black people are taught over and over again that they are inferior, eventually they will believe it. We can break that cycle through Pan-African education. So I'm going to end with something beautiful here. I'm not going to end with anything negative because it does work. And I have seen this in my own work. Malcolm X. In the UK, pretty much, Malcolm X is not even taught in our curriculum. And if he is mentioned, he is actually described as a terrorist, even still to this day. And it was only because I got the book, the autobiography of Malcolm X, that I realized that that was incorrect. And I encourage our young people to read his work, not to take everything that he says, but to read it, to inform and enhance their own opinions, and to make their own decisions, but not to be told automatically that he is a terrorist. He said the media is the most powerful entity on the earth. They have the power to make the innocent guilty and to make the guilty innocent, and that's power because they control the minds of the masses. What I say to young people is one of the things that we must do as Black people living in the diaspora, but also on the continent, is we must work harder to resist the messages that we get from the media, which, as I've already said, is a source of informal education, which tell us that we are inferior, no matter how subtle it is. We have to see those messages and we have to not internalize them. And that's one way you can do that is through Pan-African education. I'm going to talk a little bit about the media because it's so important, it's so powerful. The media has such wide reach. It's 24/7, 365 days of the year. The media is not just the news, it's television programs, it's cinema, it's newspapers, magazines, advertising, and social media as well. And what we see in the media is a pattern, bearing in mind that the media is predominantly owned by a minority of powerful white males. And what we see in the media is a pattern where Black and brown skin is highly visible when it's negative. So that's anything associated with criminality, gangs, violence, drugs, prison, terrorism, promiscuity, sexual abuse, and poverty. Blackness is very visible in the media. So what we are being taught is that Black is inferior and is more likely to be criminal, which goes back to that diagram that I showed you of structural racism, because that impacts then on sentencing in the criminal justice system. It impacts on policies that are designed by government, which target Black people as naturally and inherently criminal. It's not true, and we must work with our young people to teach them that this is what the media is telling them, but it is not true, and that they can be whatever they want to be. Moving in, Black skin, all shades, is overwhelmingly presented as an inferior problem. That's the concept of race. Black is naturally inferior. And that happens in both formal and informal education. this has impact on how we see ourselves. It has impact on our young people. And these are just some images here. I'm not going to go into all of them because I'm conscious of the time, but it's normal for us now to see Black men being violently apprehended. And then we get the justification from the media of they did this, they had a gun, they resisted arrest, they didn't comply with the officer's orders. If they just complied, we hear that over and over again. So the onus is put back on Blackness as being the cause of being violently arrested. Black people in poverty. This is one of the common images associated in particular with the African continent, which inferiorizes the African continent. This here was from a documentary. This man in the middle, his name is Ross Kemp, and he was producing a documentary on gangs in the UK. In the UK, the biggest population is the white population. And in that documentary, the majority of people that he spoke to who were active gang members were actually white. But the image that was used to promote that documentary was this one. And that's because it's normalized and expected almost for us to associate Black men with being part of gangs. Again, in the media, this is what we consistently sort of see. And this is an image of Black people living in a ghetto. It's about poverty. It's about presenting Blackness always with poverty. Again, mass incarceration, normalized for Black men to be in prison, and in particular for Black women to be seen as nothing more than sexual objects. And if our young people are seeing this and internalizing this, they will reproduce it. And we can counter it with Pan-African education. And I'm going to be coming into that in a moment. So this is a beautiful, beautiful thing. One of my young people messaged me recently, and she's a member of the Pan-African group. And she said to me, I am going to ask my school if I can deliver the assembly for Black History Month. Yes, we know that Black History is more than a month and we shouldn't just have a month. However, I love the fact that she had the confidence, because she comes to the Pan-African school, to go and say that to her school. And she asked me for some sources, and I gave her this text. I do have this book, Before the Slave Trade, African World History in Pictures by Robin Walker. There's a new study that confirms Black students who are taught racial pride do better in school. I also argue they do better in society because they have confidence in themselves. Teaching kids about their culture and involving them in activities that promote racial pride and connection helps to offset the discrimination and racial prejudices children face by the outside world. And that is true. All of the young people that come to my Pan-African school say that when they come into this space, they leave feeling good, and they take that feeling of good out into the wider world. And so when they experience racism, whether that's blatant or the structural, the insidious, the undercover, the subtle racism, they don't internalize it. They see it for what it is and dismiss it. So again, like I said, this is an example from one of my pupils. I think one of the things that we should be doing as Pan-African educators, wherever you are, is collecting more data on the benefits of Pan-African education and sharing that and promoting that and pushing that. That's what I believe that we should be doing, because it's been proven that it does make a difference, and it does in my Pan-African school and for those young people. So to give some examples of some of the things that we talk about is when I started talking to young people and I said to them, so what are you learning about Africa and the African continent, African cultures? And they're saying, well, slavery, that's what we're learning. And that we were basically sat in the jungle doing nothing, X, Y, and Z. So I called this, Who Wants to Be African? If we're going off our Eurocentric education system, no one would want to be. And we see that young people feel ashamed of their names, particularly if it's a strong, proud African name, they feel ashamed because Africa is presented as inferior. So then I call this African greatness. By teaching pre-colonial African history, as well as sharing achievements of Black people currently, we influence the perceptions of how young people see themselves. It is powerful. So we talk about Kemet. We talk about the inventions that came from Kemet. We talk about the fact that Greek philosophers, who are given a lot of credit in our Eurocentric education system as being the pioneers of modern civilization, that some of them went and got their teaching on the continent. We talk about the architecture in Songhai and how great that architecture was without any European influence. And we talk about the warrior women, particularly my young women really love that, of Dahomey. We talked about, because I showed them this image of Phocylides Castle in Ethiopia, and that was designed in the 17th century. A lot of them thought this was from Britain. And I said, nope, it's from the continent. And then we look at maps and we talk about the greatness that was there and the greatness that is within them. Again, some more examples, and I got these from the book Before the Slave Trade. So the Kingdom of Ife, this Nigerian copperhead of a king from 12th, look how exquisite that is. And we talk about the art, because this is idea that art and great art only comes from Europe, and that's what they're taught. They are shown Picasso. They're not shown any other kind of African artists. So we show this and we discuss it. The ancient manuscripts from Timbuktu in Mali, we talk about the fact that books were one of the most prized possessions in Mali. Reading, education, knowledge was one of the most prized possessions. And so I say to my young people, it should still be now. And yet we are encouraged not to read. During racialized slavery, Black people were prohibited from reading. That's how powerful it is. We looked at this, which we were looking at some of the gold jewelry that was buried with the warrior queen, Amani Shaketo, from the Empire of Kush. How exquisite that is, how beautiful it is. All of this without any European influence. And this is an ornate bowl, ivory bowl. Look how gorgeous that carving is. That was made in Sierra Leone. And again, so we talk about these objects. We talk about how these were made by African architects, African artists, African sculptures, and they leave my sessions feeling good. So this is one of the benefits of the Pan-African teaching. I'm going to come away now into, hopefully, this one and stop screen share. And so, hey, everybody, whoa, that's big. So that's been my presentation. I'm just having a look at time to see whether I've run over. I haven't. I'm just within time, which is great. So I'm going to have a quick look at the comments to see what people are saying. For everyone that's joined, come in, come out. If you've picked up something and you can take that forward into your work, into your life, then I'm blessed and I'm happy with that. And just to prove that I do have that book and I do use it, and I have a lot of books that talk about pre-colonial Africa, as well as I look at modern sources of what's going on in the continent. So there was a young man, his name's escaped me at the moment. I'll try to put it on the GPAN page. A young Black doctor who has designed a handbook to help doctors to identify and diagnose certain illnesses that present differently on Black skin. That is an amazing achievement, and his work should be credited and should be shared right across the health profession, because that is one way that you can reduce structural racism in our healthcare system, where Black people are diagnosed late, or Black people don't get a diagnosis at all, meaning that they die younger as a result of an illness that could have been cured but wasn't identified because white doctors didn't know how to identify it on Black skin. So I use modern examples as well. I'm just having a look. People are just, I'm just going to show some of these about all the greatness of Africa, and that's what I feel. Of course, there was poverty, there was wars, there were all of those things on the continent that you got everywhere else in the world. It's not something that was natural, where it makes African people inferior. And that's one of the things that I say to young people, is that when you look at how, in particular, the media present the African continent today, you will often see images of disease, poverty, civil war, rape, women being treated as less than, and it's presented as this is the continent, this is Africa, it's just inferior. And this is why we had to go in and civilize. And I say to our young people, could we go around and make a program that makes England look like a country that is rife with alcoholism, drug abuse, domestic violence, poverty? Could we do that? And they were like, yeah, we could. It just depends on the angle that you show it from. And I said, precisely correct. And that's the same when we're looking at how Africa, the continent of Africa, is portrayed across the world. It's the same thing. I'm just bringing up some comments that people are bringing up. And thank you very much for everyone that has tuned in to the talk today. I think that if you're not an educator, but you're somebody that has children, get these books, go on YouTube and find, there's so many great videos on YouTube which are all about Pan-African teaching, and that share the history, pre-colonial African history, that they are not getting in schools. So yes, we do cover things around racialized slavery and colonialism and what that meant, because those things directly impact the now. That history impacts what's happening in modern society when it comes to how Black skin is viewed and treated. So it's important that they have that understanding, but it's also important to understand that they have been led to believe that they are naturally inferior on account of their African heritage, and to feel shame for their African heritage. And if you feel shame, and if you don't love who you are, and I say this to my young people all the time, you can never achieve your potential. You can't do it. In a way, I wish I'd had somebody like me locally where I live to help me to navigate when I was a young person, because I was always seeing negative things about the African continent and always made to feel less than. And I did feel that sense of embarrassment when you're sat as the only Black pupil in an all-white classroom with a white teacher, and they're reading from a textbook and they say the word nigger, and you just die a bit inside, and you do withdraw. And you don't want to speak on it. And I remember as well a teacher saying to me, so you tell us about Martin Luther King. Now, I had actually read a book on Martin Luther King at that time, but she put me on the spot and expected me to have all this knowledge. And what she was trying to do was shift the responsibility of speaking about racism onto me. And we see that again and again and again. Now, one of the beautiful things is when my young people are attending the Pan-African school or in the Pan-African Zoom, they do now have the knowledge to challenge teachers. And some teachers sit back and say, yes, you absolutely know more than me. And it's something that we need to work on. It's something that we need to get better at. And those students come out feeling good, and they can challenge effectively, and they do it without anger. Because the anger that I think a lot of students feel when they're in school, and there's a talk around enslavement and the transatlantic slave trade, comes from the fact that they struggle to articulate how they're feeling inside. It's a very difficult thing to be able to articulate the reality of living in a racialized society. It's something that I've had to work on for years, and some of the greatest speakers on that have worked on it for years. So when you're a young person and you might be the only Black pupil in a classroom, it's exceptionally difficult. You've got to have so much confidence in yourself. And they get that when they come into a Pan-African school. I'm just adding on some more comments. And I think that, yeah, I'm coming to the end. Links. The documentary of the teacher that was talking about the fact that she couldn't look in the eyes of her Black pupils, that's called Whitewashed: Unmasking the World of Whiteness, and you can get that on YouTube. I think it's an excellent documentary, because more time when it comes to race, it's always non-white people talking about their experiences. And for this time, and that makes white the norm, it normalizes whiteness. And it also makes whiteness seem like it's the majority, when we should know, and many of us do know, that white as a racial group is the global minority. But it's a great documentary, and it's whiteness really being honest about whiteness. And it's something that I shared amongst my family as well. I said, watch this and see how it makes you feel when you watch it. The other thing was Dark Girls. I think it's 2011, but that's what it's called. And I think you could at one time get the full thing on YouTube, but I think it might be on Vimeo, which you do have to pay for. That is really looking at colorism, but colorism is a product of the white supremacist system. So it still ties into, I think colorism would be less of an issue if we had more Pan-African-led education, because it would counteract the teaching or the miseducation that we're getting within the white supremacist system. The book by Carter G. Woodson, Miseducation of the Negro, written in 1933, totally, all of it, totally relevant to today. And once you have that knowledge, you can begin to dismantle the white supremacist system and your social experiences navigating that white supremacist system, and you don't internalize, and you can challenge effectively. You can make positive choices for you and for the diaspora. It encourages unity. It decreases jealousy. It decreases anger. All of those things are low vibrational, and we cannot rise as a people if we're living in a place of anger, lack of self-belief, low self-esteem. We cannot do it. So Pan-African teaching counteracts all of those things. And if you can't get to a Pan-African school, you can most definitely do it yourself. Take responsibility for your education. That's what I did. That's what I had to do. There was nowhere for me to go. And now I have some of that knowledge. I'm not the oracle of knowledge. I'm always learning. I now am giving back to the community by leading a Pan-African school. So I'm hoping that people enjoyed today's talk, got a lot from it. Every Saturday, Race, Racism and African Heritage is leading talks that are pertinent to the African diaspora and to the continent, to Pan-Africanism, every Saturday. So please do follow GPAN. If you don't already, Global Pan-African Network, please follow us on Facebook. You can also get this talk at a later date on YouTube. Okay, much love, people, and blessings.